Okay. Hi, Eric. Welcome. Tell me, how's Max nowadays?
Max as well. I'm supposed to see him in a week's time. We're doing the film runs in the film festivals, and then in parallel there's a second life for the project, which is in exhibition spaces, and we are organizing one in San Francisco starting in a week. And the way that works is that the film is shown during the afternoons in the art center, and in the mornings we build out a little office that looks maybe a little bit less colorful than this one, but it's an office like this, and Max is there, and it's called an embassy of Abkhazia. So it's not an embassy, it's an embassy, and it's just one-on-one appointments with people who come and talk about whatever they want with Max. And then on weekends we do these sort of public programs where we invite philosophers, sociologists, different people to come and talk about nations, the emergence and disappearance of nations.
You went to Abkhazia. Can you please tell me how on earth you got in Abkhazia?
The first time I went to Abkhazia was almost 15 years ago, because it was in 2000. I was working with a very close friend of mine, his name is Leon Kolm, and he is the foremost specialist political scientist about what he called de facto states, non-recognized nations in the former Soviet Union, and it was his idea to go and visit 3 of them in the former Soviet Union. So there was Transnistria, which broke away from Moldova. So this was the summer of 2000. We went to Transnistria, then we went to Abkhazia, which broke away from Georgia, and then we finished the trip that lasted several months. We finished the trip in Nagorno-Karabakh, which broke away from Azerbaijan. And clearly, I think for both of us, it was the stop in the middle. It was Abkhazia that really struck us as the most interesting experience, because we felt like there was something particular about Abkhazia in the way in which the country had emerged from the war, the way in which it was trying to fabricate some kind of future for itself. And I think a lot of this was because of Max, in the sense that Max is somebody we met on the very first day after arriving. He was 25 years old at the time. He came to greet us at the place where we were staying. He was wearing a I Love New York t-shirt and sunglasses, and he said hello. And at the time he was just a low-level employee of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So our experience of Abkhazia is exactly parallel to our encounter with Max.
But how was he different from others that you've met?
I think Max is a very particular person. I think if Max had grown up in Holland, he would also be a very particular person. How to describe him? I think he's somebody who's extremely open-minded and who sort of floats around through life, bouncing from one poetic coincidence to another. And I think there are very few places in the world where they would appoint somebody like Max to be a minister in a government, but Abkhazia is one of those places. I think he's just somebody who is a very interesting way to encounter Abkhazia, because I think there's many different ways to tell the story of Abkhazia. Max's way of telling the story is a very particular way. You could easily meet somebody who would have a much harder approach, a more aggressive approach, a more vindictive approach. Max is far more open-minded than many people. He hasn't been hardened by the experience. And so it became clear also that this would be the relationship that should generate the film.
Yeah, he's very charming as well. That helps.
Yes, it does. I think years ago when we met and we started talking about making a film, the idea was that we would make a film that Max would be the star of. Like, there was a star quality. But obviously, this is, the Letters to Max is not a meant to be a biography of Maxim Grincha. He's meant to be sort of the counterpart in this exchange, and he bears a lot of good news, but he also bears some bad news, in the sense that there are parts in the film where we start touching upon some of the more difficult questions that that the separation from Georgia has caused. And Max becomes the person through which we experience these, we ask these questions. And so that's also something that's quite particular about the film. How do we touch upon controversial issues in the context of a friendship?
Yeah. But hold on, you said we've talked about making this film, so you never actually wrote a first letter to Max, just waiting for it to arrive.
I very much did write the letters to Max, but in parallel, maybe in 2004, 2005, I had been working as a photographer making photographs in Abkhazia, but it became clear to me, at least, that someday there would be a film. Excuse me. It became clear to me that there would be a film someday, and I think, in fact, there will be several films, because I'm working on another film which will also take place in the region, which is a fiction, a narrative fiction film. And Abkhazia, for me, is a place where I've been going for 15 years. Every 5 or 6 years, there's a new project. There have been already several versions of projects done in Abkhazia. I kind of think about it as Abkhazia changes, I change, Max changes, and over the course of our entire lifespan, I hope we will make projects every few years that reflect this evolution. So in a way, Abkhazia functions for me as a studio in some sense. You know, I don't have as much use for a studio as an artist because I don't make paintings or I don't make sculpture, but I do make works in Abkhazia, and and the works are about Abkhazia, but they're also about Max, about myself, and about our evolution.
So why the letters? Because it's kind of a structure you put on it. Why did you choose to write letters to him?
Well, it started as a joke, as a lot of things, at least in my relationship with Max. When Max was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs, for a few years I did not interact with them. I didn't want, because the nature of our relationship is very informal, and we write, you know, like everybody, we write funny emails, we send stupid things to each other. When he had became minister, I stopped communicating with him because I felt this is a very official role for him. I don't need to be sort of, you know, create something unofficial. I didn't know, I hadn't seen him in a few years. So I sort of watched from a distance, and when he lost his job after the election, he left government, and it was sort of meant as a joke. I wrote him a first letter, which literally was, and you see it in the film, you know, "Dear Max, are you there? Eric." And I put it in an envelope, and I wrote on the envelope, you know, "Maxime Vingia, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sukhum, Republic of Abkhazia," and that's all. And I put it in the mailbox next to my studio in Paris, and I did not expect the letter to go very far. I mean, I imagined the letter would arrive at the post office, and somebody would look at it, and they would type it up in the computer, and Abkhazia would not come up as in the list of countries, so they would put a stamp on it that would say, you know, "This country doesn't exist, we are returning the letter." So my initial idea was sort of a joke, and then vaguely I thought perhaps, you know, if I write a bunch of letters, they will all come back to me, and this would be like, you can imagine some kind of, I don't know, bad piece of mail art where there would be a pile of returned letters, and this would signify somehow, you know, the difficulty of recognition and bilateral relations between states. And then I forgot about it. But 10 weeks later, I got an email from Max saying, "I got your letter. I can't respond because the mail doesn't work. The paper mail does not work in the other way, so I'm writing you an email." And I thought, how is that possible? Like, how could that letter have gone there? So I sent another one, and then it became a letter a day. Not all of them arrived to Abkhazia. Some of them came back to the studio. Some of them got lost. But I think I wrote 74 letters, and about 50 of them arrived to Max. And then Max responded by recording himself every day in a microphone and a little voice recorder, you know, a little digital voice recorder. And then I went to Abkhazia a year later. So the letters take about 10 weeks to get there. Max recorded. And then I was busy making another film called The Ugly One, which was shown here last year. And when I was finished with that other film, I went to Abkhazia, picked up the sound files, the MP3s that Max had been recording, listened to them, and filmed images, and that's what's in the film.
Well, the interesting thing about the letters is that it seems like you are writing to a fantasy land.
Well, I guess you could say that in a very, specific sense of the term, Abkhazia is a fantasy land in the sense that it's a land that is the result of a fantasy, the fantasy of a independent state for the ethnic Abkhaz within the confines of Georgian borders. Call that a fantasy, at least, I don't know if that's the right word, but there's certainly an element of any state-building project that is related to the concept of imagination, of the ability to project something into a vision of the future into the future. And I certainly believe that the process of building a nation is really predicated on this idea of a collective fiction that everybody is willing to believe in enough to make it work. And this is true of any nation. I mean, France is an older nation than most. Italy or Germany are much younger nations. But what nations all share in common is, there's a French writer, Ernest Renan, who wrote about what the nation is, and he says many things that are very true. One of them is that the collective fiction of a nation is based on the ability to remember certain things together, and usually the things that you remember are linked to suffering, war, pain, and the ability to forget certain things in common. And this is certainly the case. In France, we're very good at forgetting certain less pleasant aspects of our past, and it's certainly true in Abkhazia as well. There's an obsession with the war because it's the memories of this very recent war that have created the reality of Abkhazia today. Without the war, I strongly believe there would not have been as much of a need for the Abkhaz to have their own state. The war created that need, ironically, and there's many things that they collectively are forgetting.
It's one of the things you look into in this film. Another thing is if you can make a nation with images in a way, I think. Is that true? Is that what you're trying to do in the film?
Well, there's this question of representation. Images and representation is central to the idea of the nation, and the representation in many senses. One was just this very basic question of mine. There's a territory in Abkhazia that's delineated by the sea here, the mountains to the north, and a river on either side. So this is a piece of land. What is this piece of land? Is it Georgia? Is it not Georgia? It was the Soviet Union until very recently, and then in the course of a few months it became Georgia, and then it became something else. It became a territory in dispute. And then when that dispute was settled by a military victory by Abkhaz troops with the help of local Russian forces, then the status of this land changed. But what is it? Is it Abkhazia? It's not recognized as Abkhazia. Most other states do not willingly recognize it as Abkhazia. So what happens if you take a picture there? What happens if you film? What does this form of representation do? Does it prove that this place exists as Abkhazia? So these questions are obviously very present in the film, and then the question of representation is also present, for example, in the exhibition, because when Max is present at an embassy table in his little office, he is there to represent. And so this question of representation is inherent to the question of the identity of nations and their existence in some virtual or physical world.
One of the interesting things in the film is that you say that you had the feeling that you haven't captured Abkhazia during your first trip. Did you capture it now?
I don't know. But I certainly know that the photographic attempt was probably bound to fail, because if you think about it, I mean, photography can document certain things, but what I was trying to document in my photographic approach to Abkhazia was not just the idea of statehood, which is an abstract concept, but it was the idea of non-recognized statehood, which is an abstraction within an abstraction. So it's sort of a double packaged abstraction, and the flat surface of the photographic image plane, I think, was not sufficient for me to unpack the many, many questions that this problem, within a problem, poses. And so film certainly helps in the sense that I have 24 images per second. I have sound, I have camera movement, I have editing, and I have mostly something that's become very important in my film practice, which is the ability to use sound and image either together or to desynchronize them, to create meaning in the space in between what we hear and what we see.
Can you give an example of that in your film?
Well, this is something I've been exploring in several films, but there will be a voiceover. The voiceover is generally built either from interviews that I conduct with the subjects, or in this case, it was an epistolary interview. I send a letter to Max with a question. He answers that question in his own time in a recorder. That becomes the voiceover that I edit. Then I listen to these sounds. I have a camera and I go and film in Abkhazia. And I'm generally thinking about what I've listened to that morning. You know, the process of making the film is very simple. You know, I would drink coffee in the morning in Abkhazia, listen to these MP3s, and then I would go with Sergei, who's my main person in Abkhazia, my stalker, you could say, the person who guides me through, and we go filming things. So sometimes I will hear Max talk about something that's either conceptual or specific, and I have to think, okay, what am I going to film? Either Max is telling a story. How do I make an image for this story? I can either illustrate, but that's not generally very interesting. I can either work allegorically, so I will make an image that will allegorically create a different kind of meaning when edited with this story that Max is telling, or I can actually go further. I can contradict Max. I can show an image that is disjunctive to what he is saying. And so then when you start editing the material, you have the narrator's voice, you have these images, and the editing creates either very little space between the voice and the image or a lot of space. A lot of space would be where the image completely contradicts what it is that we're hearing. In film, we are used to sound and image reinforcing each other. And I've been interested in exploring from a cinematic standpoint what happens if instead of reinforcing each other, they contradict each other. Varying degrees of contradiction, of course. And then you can narrow the gap and suddenly you bring these two back together, and that creates a different kind of cinematic journey.
But what, for example, what you tell Sergei, because you hear something and then you want to find the opposite, but you really don't know what images there are.
Well, let me try to think of an example. One example would simply be some of these decisions we don't necessarily make until the editing station, until we're actually editing. But typically in the film, there would be a number of cases where Max will be talking about some kind of celebration, whether it's a celebration of the independence of Abkhazia, its self-declared independence, the recognition of Abkhazia by Russia, and he's describing these situations, and obviously I can't film them because they happened either 5 years ago or 20 years ago. But what I can film is something equivalent that is occurring while I'm in Abkhazia, which is the 20th anniversary of the events that are being described. So I am filming a commemoration, which is really a reenactment of a celebration, to illustrate something that is being described as a celebration. And so what we're really doing is we're filming a pastiche. We're filming a false, like a meta celebration or a reenactment of a celebration, and this is very ritualized. And so this is a very different thing than showing the actual archival footage of the moment that Max is talking about. We are showing a form of authentic reenactment of that moment. So this creates a different type of meaning. I'll give you another very specific example. At the very end of the film, we are seeing this. We're seeing a military parade that is there to commemorate the 20th anniversary of Abkhazia's independence. This is, if you look at this parade, it's a very sort of Soviet-style military parade. You have officers that are there with all the medals. All the officials are standing on a balcony. It really looks like the Kremlin mausoleum, the Lenin mausoleum, during the Soviet years, where the Red Army would demonstrate. The Red Army would parade on the Red Square. the iconography, the visuals of this parade are very Soviet. And I chose to use these images to illustrate or to accompany a part of the film where I ask Max to talk about the relationship between Abkhazia and Russia, and whether or not there's a risk that Abkhazia, because it is so dependent upon Russian help, upon Russian support, whether it might not just simply become a puppet state for Russia. And Max says something which I think is probably very honest. He says, "I've never received direct orders from Moscow. This is not how it works. Nobody calls me and says, do this, do that." And then he says, "But you know, it's like living in a house where all the windows are pink. You look through the window like this, and the world is pink. So in this case, the world would be red." And he says, so if you live in this house your whole life, you think that the world beyond the window is pink. So Max has said several things. He said, first of all, I don't get direct orders from Russia. And this is probably true. But he also tells us that from the perspective of this closed-off state, the world beyond it just is tinted by the color of the window. And the third thing, which is a layer that I add, is I add this extremely sort of Soviet-style military parade underneath. So it's a way of, I'm not contradicting Max. I'm not saying that Max is minimizing something. But overall, the combination of the visuals and what Max is saying is going to give, I think, the spectator a different understanding of what it means to be under the influence of a very large neighbor that is influencing the state in many ways and has a very, very determining impact on Abkhazia. But it's not necessarily something that we would call sort of direct influence. It's a form of indirect influence that's very, very strong. But the editing of the film and what I choose to film and what I choose to edit together is going to make this point. Because Max is the sole narrator in the film. I never step in. I never bring in a specialist or an objective sort of commentator to come and provide extra meaning. This has to be done through the combination of images and sound.
Yeah. Were you afraid to ask him difficult questions about the Georgians, for example?
I don't know if afraid is the right term, but it's certainly true that the film is predicated on this friendship. And so there's certain things that you can ask friends, and there's certain ways in which you can ask these things to friends, but they're probably different than the way that you would ask them to complete strangers. And so one thing which did occur is that it took maybe 20 or 30 different, maybe it took 20 or 30 letters before I arrived at these sort of more difficult questions to ask Max. And there's a number of different letters in which we touch upon this question. But the way in which I dealt with the question was also by dealing with the nature of the film itself, which relies on a single voice. And so I ask him, here we are talking, and this film is being made with your voice, and the voice which will not be heard is the voice of a Georgian refugee who cannot be in Abkhazia right now. So how do we deal with this? Is an image enough to replace this absent voice? And then we film these houses, these empty Georgian houses. Or should I ask you to represent the perspective of an absent Georgian? Is that even possible? And so the way that the film basically deals with this question is by, I think, in my intent here, is to acknowledge the fact that I am not a filmmaker who believes in putting two antagonistic voices in front of each other in the hope of finding some kind of objective truth. I think that most traditional documentaries that seek a form of objectivity through two opposing subjectivities is not necessarily a functioning model to approach something that we could call objectivity. So if we throw this out the window and we throw the notion of objectivity out the window, the way I tend to make the films is I announce a certain kind of subjectivity, but I hope that this is very clear subjectivity, and I say this is who we're talking with, and we're not talking to this other side. But then the trick is you have to find a way to problematize the situation within this subjectivity. So there's only Max's voice, but how does the unique presence of Max allow us to touch upon these very difficult issues through this subjective perspective? And so it's going to leave a whole part of the debate outside of the film, but this whole part of the debate which is outside of the frame needs to be like anything hors champ, like anything outside of the frame in cinema that is visible. Its shadow is visible inside the frame. And so then we can start thinking about the problems.
Okay, thank you so much. If you want to ask Eric something else, he's going to be around, so please do. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.